In a world of constant stimulation and noise, we often overlook the profound strength found in silence and self-focus. The human brain is a remarkably adaptive organ designed to process an extraordinary volume of sensory input, but it wasn't built for the unrelenting flood of notifications, opinions, and distractions that modern life delivers. At a fundamental level, our nervous system is wired to seek clarity and order, yet we repeatedly expose it to chaos and confusion. When we talk about focusing on yourself and staying silent, we are not referring to isolation or disengagement. We are referring to a powerful, science-backed process of internal regulation, neurological reset, and deliberate intention. From a neurobiological standpoint, attention is a limited resource. The prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and goal-oriented behavior, operates with a finite capacity. The more we divide our attention among external demand, social media, conversations, gossip, criticism, the less bandwidth remains for self-directed growth. When we choose to focus on ourselves, we begin to reallocate cognitive resources. Instead of constantly reacting, we become proactive. We shift from survival mode, dominated by the amygdala and emotional reactivity, to a state of deliberate frontal lobe-driven action. Silence plays an essential role in this process, not just the absence of speech, but true silence, a deliberate pause from engagement, from broadcasting, from seeking validation. There's emerging evidence that intentional silence, especially when combined with practices like mindfulness and deep breathing, stimulates parasympathetic activity. That's the rest and digest system. It brings down cortisol, slows the heart rate, and rebalances the autonomic nervous system. What this means practically is that silence doesn't just calm your mind, it recalibrates your entire physiological state, allowing your internal systems to operate at optimal levels. Many people misunderstand silence as weakness. In fact, silence is often the greatest demonstration of strength. When you stay silent, you are resisting the primitive urge to defend, to retaliate, to explain. That urge arises from deep within the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotion and memory. But when you stay silent, you're exercising top-down control. You're using your prefrontal cortex to override the immediate emotional reaction. That is neuroplasticity in action. Over time, this practice strengthens the neural circuits responsible for self-regulation. You literally become more resilient, more composed, more centered. When you focus on yourself, you begin to tune into the signals your body and brain are giving you. These are the signals most people ignore because they are too busy paying attention to the outside world. Your energy levels, your sleep patterns, your mood fluctuations, all of these are feedback loops. They are real-time data points on how your internal systems are functioning. If you're constantly engaged with external drama, you'll miss the internal cues telling you what you need to adjust. Maybe your dopamine levels are depleted. Maybe your circadian rhythm is misaligned. Maybe your gut-brain axis is inflamed. You won't know unless you tune in. Focusing on yourself means optimizing those internal systems through intentional behavior. It's about aligning your routines, nutrition, exercise, sleep, learning, with the biological rhythms that govern performance and well-being. We know, for example, that early morning light exposure helps set the circadian clock, improving sleep quality and cognitive function. We know that regular movement, particularly cardiovascular exercise, enhances neurogenesis in the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory and learning. These are not just lifestyle tips, they are essential levers of self-directed transformation. Now here's the interesting paradox. The more you focus inward, the more powerful your external impact becomes. Not because you're trying to prove anything, but because your internal state begins to radiate coherence. The human nervous system is attuned to coherence. We unconsciously pick up on other people's emotional regulation, confidence, and clarity. This is a product of mirror neurons and the social brain. When someone is grounded and self-possessed, others feel it. They don't have to announce it. They don't have to defend it. It's biologically felt. This is why staying silent is such a powerful form of communication. It disrupts the pattern, it creates space, and in that space others begin to notice things they overlooked. Your absence in unnecessary conversations speaks volumes about your priorities. Your decision not to explain yourself conveys more authority than any justification could. You're not trying to be mysterious, you're just not leaking energy. Every word, every explanation, every outburst costs you something neurologically. There's glucose consumption in the brain, there's increased sympathetic activity, there's cognitive fatigue. Silence is conservation. And conservation leads to elevation. It's also worth considering how silence and solitude enhance creativity. The brain's default mode network, which is active during periods of rest and introspection, is directly associated with creative thought, self-reflection, and memory consolidation. When you're constantly engaged with the external world, that network never has a chance to activate fully. It's like trying to write a book in a room full of shouting people. The silence you create is not emptiness. It's a laboratory where new ideas are synthesized, where patterns are recognized, where meaning is constructed. Focusing on yourself isn't selfish, it's foundational. Many people feel uncomfortable with silence because it forces them to confront themselves. That discomfort is not a signal to flee, it's a signal to pay attention. In neuroscience, we often look at the concept of prediction error, the difference between expected and actual outcomes. When you're silent and self-focused, you're disrupting the habitual feedback loop. You're no longer getting constant affirmation or distraction. That creates space for a new, more accurate model of yourself to emerge, one that's not shaped by external praise or criticism, but by direct experience and reflection. As you develop this internal model, your sense of identity becomes more stable. You become less reactive to others' opinions because you're not relying on them to tell you who you are. That's psychological sovereignty. It's built through deliberate practice, journaling, contemplation, focused reading, solitude. You don't need to isolate yourself entirely, but you do need to carve out intentional space where your thoughts can settle and your nervous system can reset. Just as muscles grow in recovery, not in activity, the mind strengthens in silence. It's also essential to understand that focusing on yourself and remaining silent does not mean disengagement from life. It means engaging from a deeper, more grounded place. When your nervous system is balanced and your mind is clear, your actions carry more precision, you speak when it matters, you listen with full attention. You choose your battles wisely. That's not avoidance, that's strategic engagement. Silence gives you the edge by increasing signal-to-noise ratio in your own life. You start to see what actually deserves your energy. One of the most powerful tools in behavioral neuroscience is the practice of deliberate behavior pairing. That means linking specific habits or practices to internal goals rather than external validation. For instance, instead of going to the gym to look good for others, you train because you understand how movement optimizes brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a molecule that enhances learning and mood. Instead of meditating to appear calm, you do it because it enhances cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex, increasing your resilience. These are inwardly anchored motivations. They create long-term behavioral sustainability. When your behavior is anchored internally, you don't need to announce your progress. You're not addicted to likes, comments, or applause. You're driven by data, your own internal metrics, better focus, calmer mornings, deeper sleep. That's where real motivation comes from, and the beautiful irony is, once you stop performing for others, your results tend to speak for themselves. People begin to ask you what changed. They notice the calm in your voice, the intention in your movement, the clarity in your decisions. And you don't need to explain, you've built it from the inside out. Silence also helps with emotional processing. When we speak too quickly, we often bypass the essential neurological stages of emotional regulation. Emotional responses arise from deep subcortical structures, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and they need to be integrated through higher-order systems. That takes time and reflection. Speaking prematurely can freeze the emotional state before it's been fully metabolized. Silence gives the brain time to integrate, make meaning, and recalibrate. It's an emotional detox. It's not repression, it's maturation. When you focus on yourself, you also start noticing how much energy is wasted on things beyond your control. Control is a key concept in neuroscience. The brain craves agency, and when it loses a sense of control, it shifts into threat mode. You start scanning for danger, interpreting neutral situations as hostile. By redirecting attention toward what you can influence, your habits, your mindset, your breathing, you restore agency. That agency reactivates the prefrontal cortex and reduces limbic reactivity. It's a neurobiological loop. Focus builds control, and control enhances focus. Over time, silence becomes more than a strategy. It becomes your default mode, not because you're avoiding the world, but because you've tuned into a deeper signal. You realize that not every comment needs a reply, not every invitation deserves a yes, not every battle is worth fighting. That realization doesn't come from theory. It comes from practice, from deliberate, focused silence, from choosing presence over performance, from understanding that growth isn't always loud. Sometimes, the biggest transformations happen quietly, beneath the surface, rewiring your nervous system one moment at a time. You begin to experience time differently when you stay silent and focus inward. Most people operate in what could be called reactive time, constantly responding, constantly adjusting to the pace of others. But when you reclaim your attention, your perception of time slows down. This isn't just psychological, it's physiological. When your autonomic nervous system is balanced, particularly with a dominant parasympathetic tone, your internal sense of time lengthens, you gain clarity, you stop rushing, you begin to experience what is sometimes described as deep time, a state of grounded awareness where each moment expands. In this state, decision-making becomes more accurate. The brain is no longer rushing to find the fastest solution. It's searching for the most effective one. You begin to notice the micro-signals, the subtle reactions in your body, the small shifts in your environment that guide more refined choices. This is not instinct in the primal sense. It's intuition developed from careful observation and internal alignment. Silence sharpens intuition, because it filters out the noise that normally clouds perception. When you're constantly speaking or engaging, your cognitive bandwidth is spread thin. In silence, it condenses and intensifies. There's also a neurochemical shift that occurs when you regularly engage in silence and introspection. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation and reward, begins to recalibrate. In environments filled with constant stimulation, scrolling, texting, watching, you're artificially spiking dopamine, which leads to desensitization. But when you remove those external triggers and focus inward, your dopamine system resets. You begin to derive satisfaction from simpler, more meaningful activities, reading a page, completing a task, taking a walk. All of it starts to feel rewarding again. This is not just a mood shift, it's a rewiring of the brain's reward circuitry. Over time, this shift affects your entire behavioral architecture. You stop chasing intensity and start seeking depth. You no longer need to impress people with your words because your actions become more intentional. You move with clarity, you speak only when your words add value, and you begin to conserve your energy in ways that amplify your impact. There's something profoundly magnetic about a person who is calm and self-contained. It's not about arrogance, it's about coherence. The internal systems are synchronized. The person doesn't leak energy through over-explaining or overreacting. They've trained their nervous system to stay in balance even when the environment isn't. This kind of self-mastery takes time. It's not achieved through passive waiting. It's earned through deliberate practice. Each time you resist the urge to comment unnecessarily, each time you choose stillness over reaction, you're reinforcing a new neural pathway. That's how long-term change happens, through repetition, through friction, through conscious discomfort. The initial silence might feel awkward, even lonely, because we're used to validation loops, but over time, the silence becomes a sanctuary. It becomes a signal to your brain that you are safe, you are in control, and you are no longer at the mercy of external chaos. As this internal environment stabilizes, something else happens. You begin to hear your true thoughts. Not the noise conditioned by culture, media, or peers, but the original thoughts born from observation, lived experience, and personal truth. These thoughts are clearer, more precise. They are less reactive and more grounded. They form the basis of authentic self-expression, and the irony is, once you find this deeper voice, you no longer feel the need to use it all the time. You recognize the power of restraint. You see how selective speech carries more impact than constant commentary. There's a concept in neuroscience called salience detection. It refers to the brain's ability to prioritize what matters. A mind flooded with external input loses salience. Everything begins to feel urgent, important, worthy of attention. But in silence, your brain recalibrates. It learns to distinguish the signal from the noise. This is a critical function. It allows you to stop wasting time on trivialities and focus your attention on what truly moves the needle in your life. Relationships, health, mastery, contribution, these are the things that grow when your focus is internal and your speech is intentional. You'll also begin to recognize patterns in your behavior and thought processes. This is the gift of observation. When you're not constantly talking or reacting, you create space for self-audit. You see where your triggers are. You begin to understand your emotional cycles. You notice how certain environments, people, or behaviors affect your mental state. This is not about judgment. It's about awareness, and awareness is the first step toward change. When you can see yourself clearly, you can intervene strategically. You can break old patterns and install new ones. This observational clarity extends to your relationships as well. When you stop reacting verbally, you become a better listener, and listening, true, undistracted listening, is rare. Most people are just waiting for their turn to speak. But when you stay silent and focused, you hear more than words. You hear tone, pacing, emotional cues. You start to see what people are really saying beneath the surface. This gives you an edge, not to manipulate, but to understand. And understanding is power. It's the foundation of influence, empathy, and effective leadership. Your environment begins to change as well. People start to respond differently to your presence. When you stop broadcasting everything, you create a kind of mystery. Not forced, not calculated, just a natural byproduct of self-containment. People begin to value your words more because they're rare. They begin to trust your judgment more because you don't speak impulsively. Silence becomes a form of authority, and that authority doesn't need to be announced. It's felt. It's seen in your posture, your gaze, your consistency. Over time, you may even find that silence becomes your default state in moments of stress. Instead of escalating with anger or panic, you go inward, you breathe, you observe. This is emotional intelligence at its highest form, not the suppression of emotion, but the intelligent processing of it. You let the emotion rise, you acknowledge it, and you let it pass without turning it into destructive speech or action. That ability to pause is a neurochemical superpower. It reduces the impact of stress on your body, preserves relationships, and keeps you aligned with your long-term goals. This level of self-regulation also fosters a deep sense of self-trust. When you know you won't betray your values in a moment of anger, when you know you can sit in discomfort without lashing out, you begin to respect yourself more. And self-respect is the foundation of confidence, not the loud, performative kind, but the quiet, durable kind that cannot be shaken by circumstances. It's built through discipline, through self-focus, through intentional silence. As your inner world stabilizes, your vision for the future sharpens, you begin to see where you want to go, not because someone told you, but because your own mind is finally quiet enough to hear itself. That vision becomes a filter. It helps you decide what to say yes to, what to walk away from, where to invest your time and energy. This is how silent focus becomes strategic. You're not just zoning out, you're zoning in. On what matters, on what lasts. The more you practice, the more you realize that the most productive people aren't always the busiest. They're the clearest, and clarity comes from silence, not from doing more, but from doing less with more intention. It comes from pruning distractions, saying no to noise, and sitting with your own thoughts long enough to organize them. That process of internal organization is what gives rise to breakthroughs. It's what allows you to connect dots that others miss. It's what makes you original. In a noisy world, originality is rare. Most people are just echoes, repeating what they've heard, chasing trends, seeking approval. But when you cultivate silence, you begin to think differently. You access your own wisdom. You become less interested in being impressive and more interested in being effective. That effectiveness shows up in everything, in how you speak, how you move, how you work. It's not forced, it's not flashy, it's just precise. Precision is what the brain loves most. It craves order, clarity, and direction. When your actions are precise, your mind relaxes, your stress goes down. Your productivity goes up, and your results begin to compound. Small actions, taken from a place of internal focus, create exponential outcomes. This is not motivational theory, it's neuroscience. Consistency plus clarity equals acceleration. Eventually, silence becomes not just a strategy, but a way of being. It's not about withdrawing from life, it's about mastering your approach to it. You learn to speak when it builds, not when it breaks. You engage when it uplifts, not when it depletes, and in doing so, you protect your energy, your vision, and your peace. The deeper you go into this practice, the more you realize how little you actually need from the outside world. Validation, praise, distraction, all of it fades in significance when you've built something stronger inside. You don't just survive silence, you thrive in it, because silence isn't emptiness, it's alignment. It's clarity, it's power, and once you experience that kind of internal power, you'll never trade it again for noise. You start to realize something fundamental about life when you stay in silence and focus on yourself. Most of what you were reacting to didn't even deserve a reaction. When the noise settles and your nervous system isn't constantly hijacked by urgency or distraction, you begin to see what actually matters. You start noticing how many decisions you made out of fear. Fear of missing out, fear of judgment, fear of falling behind. But in silence, that fear loses its grip. Because you're no longer running on adrenaline, you're not rushing to keep up. You're creating your own rhythm, and rhythm matters more than speed. Rhythm sustains energy. Speed without rhythm burns out. When you slow down and observe yourself, your habits, and your mental chatter, you begin to understand how much of your energy was being drained by things that weren't aligned with who you really are. You were giving explanations where none were needed, seeking clarity from people who were confused themselves, and accepting standards that were never yours to begin with. But silence strips all of that away. It simplifies your perception. It turns down the volume on the world's expectations and turns up the volume on your own values. That's when the real shift happens, not externally, but internally. You stop moving in response to pressure and start moving with purpose. That's a massive neurobiological shift, because the brain, when not constantly reacting to external stimulus, begins to rely more heavily on its prefrontal cortex. That's where executive function lives: planning, problem solving, emotional regulation. You literally start operating from a higher part of your brain. You're less likely to be triggered, more likely to pause, more capable of long-term thinking. This change doesn't require some profound external transformation. It just requires the space that silence creates. Most people fear silence because it reveals the unfinished business within, the unprocessed emotions, the lingering resentment, the insecurities, the regret. But that's exactly why it's so necessary. You can't clean a room in the dark. Silence turns the lights on. It makes you see everything that's been there, even if you've ignored it for years, and once you see it, you can address it, not all at once, but piece by piece. You begin to work through things instead of around them. You build self-awareness not as a concept, but as a living practice, and with that awareness comes choice. You're no longer operating from conditioned patterns. You're operating from conscious presence. When you focus on yourself deeply, without the need for external validation, you begin to reclaim the parts of you that you outsourced to other people. You no longer need someone to approve of your goals before you pursue them. You stop waiting for the right time, the right feedback, or the right audience. You just start, because you're not performing anymore. You're building. That's the difference between external focus and internal alignment. One waits for permission, the other moves from conviction. Conviction is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It shows up in consistency, in repetition, in your ability to do the work even when no one is watching. And that's where growth really happens, in the unseen moments, when it's just you and your thoughts, you and the effort, you and the discomfort of becoming someone better. No applause, no recognition, just evolution. That's what silence teaches you, to detach from applause and attach to effort, to find satisfaction not in the outcome, but in the process of alignment. Over time, you begin to trust yourself more, because you're no longer making promises you don't keep. You're not leaking energy through overcommitment. You say less, but you do more. You talk less about change, and you embody it. That congruence between thought, word, and action is what builds real self-esteem. And it doesn't come from positive affirmations. It comes from evidence, from keeping your word to yourself, from showing up even on the days you don't feel like it. Silence becomes a mirror, and it reflects the truth with precision. You can't hide behind distractions when you've removed them. You can't pretend you're okay when you've created enough stillness to actually feel what's going on inside, but that honesty is liberating. Because from that truth, you can build something real, something that doesn't collapse under pressure, something that doesn't require a mask or a persona to sustain. You begin to live in integrity, and that creates a level of peace that's unshakable. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become stronger, quieter, more focused. When you focus on yourself and remain silent, you also develop a kind of emotional detachment from drama. You stop being so easily provoked. You see the patterns in people's behavior, and instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of engaging, you discern. Emotional detachment isn't about being cold, it's about being clear. Clear on what deserves your energy and what doesn't. Clear on the difference between a crisis and a distraction. You stop making everything about you, and that's what makes you powerful. You become the calm in the storm, not the one chasing every lightning strike. You begin to value your energy differently. You protect your attention like it's your most precious resource, because it is. You realize that what you focus on grows. If you feed fear, it expands. If you feed confidence, it compounds. If you feed clarity, it crystallizes, so you become deliberate. You begin each day not by checking what the world wants from you, but by deciding what you want to give to the world. That's focus, that's discipline. And it only comes when you cut out the noise and sit long enough with yourself to know what you actually believe, value, and want. In silence, you also start to feel your body differently. Most people live entirely in their heads, disconnected from their somatic reality. But when you quiet the mind, the body begins to speak. You notice tension that you've been carrying for years. You feel your breath, your heartbeat, your posture. You begin to understand how your physiology affects your psychology. And that awareness allows you to make better choices about food, sleep, movement, recovery. You're not just thinking clearer, you're living better, because your body is no longer a machine you drive. It's a partner you listen to. Over time, this internal integration creates a kind of harmony. You're no longer at war with yourself. You're not running from your thoughts, avoiding your emotions, or pretending to be someone you're not. You're centered, grounded, clear. That kind of clarity changes how you show up in every area of life. In relationships, you're more present. In work, you're more efficient. In challenges, you're more resilient. Not because you've eliminated chaos, but because you've anchored yourself in something deeper than it. The truth is, the world will never stop being noisy. People will always have opinions. Trends will keep shifting. Expectations will evolve. But when you focus on yourself and stay silent, you build a stillness that moves with you, a calm that travels, a presence that doesn't need to shout to be felt. That presence changes rooms. It changes conversations. It changes outcomes. And it begins with the quiet, consistent decision to turn inward, to listen deeply, to speak less, and to act with precision. And the beauty of this practice is that it's always available. You don't need perfect conditions. You don't need approval. You just need intention. The intention to choose stillness over noise, depth over drama, substance over spectacle. Each time you do, you're not just surviving the moment. You're reshaping your mind. You're designing your future. You're becoming someone that doesn't just move through the world, but moves the world quietly, powerfully, relentlessly. When you live with that level of awareness, you start to notice the gap between action and reaction. Most people blur the two. Something happens, they respond instantly, someone offends them, they retaliate, they're criticized, they defend, but with silence and inward focus, a space opens up, and in that space you gain leverage. You can pause, assess, and choose a response that serves your long-term direction, not just your momentary emotion. That's cognitive control in real time. It's the difference between being a puppet of your impulses and becoming a strategist of your behavior. This type of self-mastery isn't about perfection. It's about presence, about constantly returning to yourself when the world tries to pull you away. Every distraction that enters your day is an invitation to fragment your attention. And every time you choose to stay centered, you're rewiring your brain, literally. You're strengthening the neural networks responsible for sustained attention, impulse control, and inner stability. Over time, those patterns become your default. You're no longer fighting against chaos. You're immune to it because you're not feeding it. You're not participating in it. You're observing it like weather passing through a sky you no longer leave inside. You also begin to see the cost of over-explaining yourself. Silence teaches you that people understand you only to the extent of their own perception. If someone is committed to misunderstanding you, more words won't help. They'll just distort those too. But when you stop explaining and start embodying your truth, clarity happens on its own, not through persuasion, but through consistency. People may not understand you immediately, but over time, your actions reveal everything they need to know. And that clarity outlasts any speech. This is how integrity is formed, not in what you say, but in what you do repeatedly when no one's looking. Your rituals become more sacred. Your boundaries become more firm. Your self-talk becomes cleaner. You stop beating yourself up for every misstep. Instead, you examine the data, you learn from it, you adapt. That's what internal focus does. It transforms failure into feedback. You're not attached to being perfect. You're attached to evolving, and that mindset removes the shame that keeps most people stuck. You're too focused on building to waste time on guilt. In that building, you also redefine success. It's no longer about how it looks to others. It's about how it feels to you. You stop chasing outcomes that impress the crowd and start designing a life that nourishes your soul. That shift creates a paradox. The less you try to impress people, the more respect you command. Because authenticity is magnetic. You're not trying to fit in. You're making space for others to be themselves by being fully yourself. And that kind of presence creates deep trust, even without many words. As your values crystallize, you also become more discerning about what you allow into your life. You stop calling it selfish to protect your peace. You stop apologizing for saying no to people, places, and situations that cost more than they give. Because you've done the math, you understand that every yes to something unaligned is a no to something essential. And when you stay silent long enough, your internal compass gets sharper. You don't need a 5-point checklist to make a decision. You feel it. You trust that feeling because you've trained it. You've stripped away the noise long enough to hear what your intuition actually sounds like. With that clarity, even your goals change. You stop setting goals just for achievement's sake. You start aligning them with your core purpose. Your productivity becomes purposeful. Your effort becomes energized, not because you're grinding harder, but because you're moving in harmony with yourself. That harmony creates momentum. You're not pushing a boulder uphill. You're flowing with gravity because everything you're doing is anchored in who you are. And when your identity and your actions align, progress becomes inevitable. It stops being a fight. It becomes a flow state. People often confuse silence with passivity, but nothing could be further from the truth. Silence isn't retreat, it's recalibration. When used correctly, it becomes the most active form of growth. You're not broadcasting, you're not reacting, you're studying, you're refining. You're collecting data from your own behavior, your own biology, your own thoughts. You're running experiments, adjusting inputs, observing results. That's how mastery happens, quietly, iteratively, intentionally. This applies to relationships as well. When you're silent and self-aware, you become less dependent on emotional highs to feel connected. You value depth over drama. You look for consistency, not chemistry alone. You ask better questions, not out loud, but within. Does this connection align with my peace? Is this relationship building me or draining me? Can I be silent around this person and still feel understood? Those questions don't require answers in words. They're answered through your nervous system. And when your internal state is calm, you can actually hear those answers. The benefit of internal focus is that it teaches you emotional sovereignty. You stop outsourcing your mood to others. Someone's bad day doesn't hijack your peace. Someone's disapproval doesn't derail your mission. You become anchored in a space within that can't be shaken by external turbulence. And from that space, you can respond with compassion, not codependency. You can support others without losing yourself. You can love without needing to be needed. That's not coldness, that's clarity. The more you sit in silence, the more you realize that you are not your thoughts. You are the observer of them, and in that space between thought and awareness, you find power. You begin to see that not every thought deserves a reaction. Not every story your mind tells you is true. The brain produces content. It doesn't always produce clarity, and when you stop reacting to every mental notification, your thoughts settle. You move from chaos to coherence, from analysis paralysis to clear intuition. In that coherence, time slows down. You experience the richness of the present moment with greater depth. A walk feels different, a conversation feels different, even solitude feels fuller because you're not trying to escape the moment, you're inhabiting it fully. That presence becomes a superpower. It sharpens your memory, enhances your perception, deepens your relationships. You're no longer living life distracted. You're living it aware. That awareness makes you more intentional in every detail. You choose your inputs more carefully, the media you consume, the food you eat, the people you interact with. You stop indulging in things that make you feel scattered, anxious, or numb, not because you're forcing discipline, but because you genuinely prefer clarity over chaos. You've tasted inner stillness, and now everything is measured against that baseline. If it disrupts your peace, it's not worth it. You also become more grateful, not in a performative sense, but in a grounded one. Gratitude emerges not just from noticing what you have, but from realizing what you no longer need. You've shed the unnecessary. You've detoxed from comparison, validation, noise, and what remains is real. Tangible, meaningful, that's the kind of gratitude that creates fulfillment. Not the fleeting kind that depends on circumstances, but the deep kind that's rooted in alignment. And because your gratitude isn't shallow, your ambition doesn't become toxic. You still have goals, you still want more, but your desire is no longer driven by lack, it's driven by vision. You're not running from yourself, you're building toward your highest potential, and that shift changes everything. It changes how you work, how you compete, how you rest. You're not afraid of pausing because you're not driven by fear anymore. You're driven by purpose, and purpose isn't loud, it's steady, it doesn't panic, it plans. It doesn't compare, it creates. As this becomes your new normal, your emotional set point changes. What once triggered you now teaches you. What once drained you now reveals what you need to eliminate. You're not just more resilient, you're more responsive because you've practiced staying with discomfort long enough to understand it. You've sat with your thoughts long enough to outgrow them. You've chosen silence long enough to discover your real voice. That voice doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need constant approval, it speaks only when it has something meaningful to say, and when it does, it's heard not because it's loud, but because it's rare. Because it carries the weight of reflection, of discernment, of authenticity. That's the kind of voice the world needs more of, and it's cultivated not through performance, but through presence, through stillness. Through staying quiet long enough to know what truly matters. You stop chasing applause and start cultivating alignment. You realize that peace is not something you find, it's something you return to. And that return happens each time you choose yourself, each time you sit with discomfort instead of avoiding it, each time you delay reaction in favor of reflection, each time you hold your energy instead of leaking it through unnecessary speech or scattered focus. Those moments build a life, not just any life, but one that feels honest, one that feels whole, one that doesn't need to be explained to be felt. In the end, choosing to focus on yourself and embrace silence is not about isolating from the world. It's about returning to yourself so you can meet the world from a place of strength, clarity, and truth. It's about learning to regulate your own mind so that external chaos doesn't become internal noise. It's about building a foundation so stable that you no longer need constant reassurance, validation, or reaction. When you cultivate that inner stillness, your life begins to shift. Not through force, but through alignment. And in that alignment, you don't just survive, you lead, you grow, and you thrive quietly, powerfully, unapologetically.